Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining with us today. Today is the rarest day of the year, Rare Disease Day. Always an exciting time for us. My name is Craig Lambert. I'm the Executive Director for the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association. I'm also a hepatologist at Indiana University. So every year on February 28th or 29th in leap years, we hope that the world zeroes in and focuses energy on rare diseases in order to raise awareness of these illnesses that impact over 300 million people worldwide. That's 3 to 5% of the population, mind you. And autoimmune hepatitis is just one of the more than 7,000 rare diseases. Rare Disease Day started in 2008 as a globally coordinated effort and a way to get patients with rare disease a means to ensure rare disease advocacy. And this really has been critical, as those with rare disease are more likely to have misdiagnosis or even delayed diagnoses, isolation, even treatment inequality for that matter. But another goal of Rare Disease Day is to promote equal opportunity for rare patients to attain their best health through excellent healthcare and access to treatments. And these aims align well with what we've done at the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association all year long for patients that have AIH, as well as their family members and caregivers as well. As our mission is really to provide support and hope to patients and families through disease education and research opportunities. And all of this is exactly why we're focusing our rare disease programming on an area we need to know more about: clinical trials, and specifically what they are and why they're important, particularly in diseases such as autoimmune hepatitis. So without further ado, I want to introduce, and it's my pleasure to introduce, Dr. Noreen R. Henig. Dr. Henig joined Kezar Life Sciences in May 2021 as the Chief Medical Officer. And before she joined this biotech industry, Dr. Henig has spent almost a decade in leadership roles at Stanford, California Pacific Medical Center, and she's board certified physician in pulmonary critical care medicine and even eligible in allergy and immunology. Her career has really spanned everything from clinical practice to academic medicine to translational science, as well as medical and regulatory affairs. And as the CMO for Kezar Life Sciences, she's responsible for leading the team and overseeing all development activities for Kezar's immunologic or immunology platforms. And so with that, we're really honored to have her here today to share her thoughts and insights with us about clinical trials, as well as the future clinical trial named Portola study. So thank you, Dr. Henig, for being with us today.
No, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everybody on Rare Disease Day. It is a really unique opportunity to celebrate a group of unique individuals living with diseases that don't always get the attention that they deserve. And I'm very excited to be here and to share with you what Kezar is doing to bring some attention to autoimmune hepatitis, and look forward to partnering with all of you in the coming years as we work to bring new therapies to patients with autoimmune hepatitis. Let me tell you a little bit about Kezar Life Sciences. Kezar is a small biotech company. I get to work and have the privilege of working with 90 of the most amazing colleagues you could ever want to work with. The company was founded in 2015 by our CEO, John Fowler, and our Chief Scientific Officer, Chris Kirk. We're headquartered in South San Francisco, but we have work with people across the country. We are pioneering first-in-class therapy. So the therapy that I'm going to tell you about today that we're looking to do to see if it could possibly work in autoimmune hepatitis is unlike any therapy that you've probably heard about before. And we believe that our approach as a company is that we target kind of fundamental processes or machinery in our body that may have been working off kilter, and that is driving some of the disease that somebody is experiencing. And we are working on this one specific molecule called zetomipzomib, specifically for treat a range of autoimmune diseases, including autoimmune hepatitis, but we are also working on studies in patients who have lupus nephritis and other forms of autoimmune disease. So Dr. Lambert already kind of gave away, like, what does it mean to have a rare disease? And a disease is considered rare in the United States when it affects fewer than 200,000 people. There are currently more than 7,000 rare diseases affecting more than 30 million Americans. And Rare Disease Day was established acknowledging the need to bring attention to the fact that while there may not be a lot of people living with one particular rare disease, there are actually a lot of people living with a rare disease around the world. And so this effort has really changed the landscape of drug development. And it's very impactful as a groundroots organization that has brought attention and scientific attention and medical advancement for patients living with rare disease. Today, we're going to focus on autoimmune hepatitis. It is considered a rare disease. It affects an estimated approximately 30 per 100,000 people. And so if you do the math, you quickly figure out that that's less than 200,000 people in the United States. And there's similar numbers of people living with this disease in Europe. And we also recognize that it affects people in Asia and Latin America as well. So I'm going to briefly transition and talk a little bit about clinical trials, because that's one of the things we often get the most questions about. Like, what does a development pathway mean? What does clinical trials mean? What is their intention, and why are they so hard to find and participate in? So let's just start with the definition of what is a clinical trial. So clinical trials are a research study that are carefully designed to figure out if a new potential therapy is safe and effective. They are at the heart of all medical advances. And at the heart of it, it's not just about saying a drug can do something, but it's proving it. And before you even can prove that it can do something, you actually have to prove that it's safe, that you're not going to hurt somebody more than you could potentially help them. Before new drugs are tested in people, they undergo rigorous testing in the laboratory. We call this preclinical research, or before the clinic research. And we emphasize the safety portion of it. We emphasize understanding what the new potential therapy might do in a human body. We understand how it's metabolized, what's the best way to give it. And we answer all of those questions before we even initiate the clinical trial. And then once you take that potential new therapy to clinical trials, you move it through what are called different phases of clinical trials. And I'll go into more detail about that. But essentially, each phase has a specific goal. And the earlier trials, the number one goal is actually safety. Again, that same spirit of make sure that whatever therapy you're bringing forward is safe enough to help someone with the disease and will not hurt them further. And then in later trials, your goal of the clinical trial is actually to prove that it works the way you think it's going to work. So let's talk about some of the basics of clinical trials, because these are some words that get thrown around, and some of them don't necessarily mean what you think they're going to mean. So I'm just going to go through it because I'm going to throw these terms around in the later part of the talk, and I want to make sure that everyone understands. So the first is a protocol. And so a protocol is really the instruction manual for how a clinical trial is going to be conducted. It goes into an incredible amount of specifics, down to kind of what is the procedures of the trial, how are you going to collect the information from patients, how are you going to store the drug. It includes educational plans. And so it's very, very specific. A protocol for any clinical trial can run hundreds of pages long. The protocol is then submitted to what's called an institutional review board. And the institutional review board, in some countries, it's actually called an ethics board. In our country, it's called an institutional review board. But it's a committee of people usually affiliated with the institution that might participate in conducting the clinical trial. And they independently monitor the trials in the US to make sure that as a participant in the trial, that you are fully protected, that risks are reduced, that the information being gathered in the study will actually be used for the purposes of understanding the goal of the protocol. And also, it provides a very independent person to kind of ensure that the protocol will be able to accomplish what it says it's going to do and do so in the safest possible way. Once the Institutional Review Board approves a protocol to be conducted at a specific site, then that site actually will approach a person who might be a good participant in the clinical trial with a document which we call the informed consent. And an informed consent is essentially a distillation of that 100+ page protocol that I mentioned for the person to read and to really understand both the upside and the downside of participating in any clinical trial. It's also a really good opportunity to ask questions about the clinical trial kind of before you would sign up. And so it's not just about signing a piece of paper, it's really about taking the opportunity to educate yourself about the trial. The clinical trial sponsor is the company or the institution that is conducting the clinical trial. We design the trial, we pay for the trial, we know what our goals of the trial are. And because of that, the onus of responsibility is on us to initiate, manage, finance the clinical trial and make sure that it is conducted with the utmost of integrity and follows all the rules of good clinical practice. Moving to the right-hand side of the slide, we have 4 more terms to go through. One is called placebo, and placebo is, some people will refer to this as the sugar pill part of the trial. And essentially, it's an inactive product that looks and smells and tastes or is administered exactly the same way as the potential therapeutic drug that you are investigating. And what we've learned through rigorous studies of how to best conduct a clinical trial is that the most informative clinical trials are called placebo-controlled trials, where a portion of the people enrolled in the trial will get placebo, which means you wouldn't expect anything to happen. And a portion of the patients will get the potential new therapy, and you get to compare the differences. And that makes a lot of sense, especially when you're talking about complex diseases where people can experience a lot of different things over weeks to months living with their actual disease. So this is a really good way of comparing what would happen naturally or naturally under the umbrella of a trial versus people who get the new what we call intervention or investigational medicinal product, which is just other words of saying a potential new therapy. A blinded study is when the people who are conducting the trial don't know if the person participating in the trial is getting the placebo or is getting the active drug. And again, this is the best way of being able to answer the question at the end of the trial: did this medicine make a difference? And what difference did it make? And it's by comparing it. So you can easily imagine that if the people who are conducting the trial, which means the site investigators or the research coordinators, or even the people at the company knew what somebody was getting, then that would introduce a certain amount of bias. So we prevent that bias by putting in what are called blinding protocols so that nobody really knows what somebody is getting. This is in contrast to an open label study where everybody knows what they are getting. And as you will see when I talk about the study we're actually conducting, we are conducting the study in 2 parts, both a blinded portion and an open label portion. And an open label extension is just a second part of a study. It's protocol, it has its own protocol as well. So it's conducted in exactly the same way and with the same rigor as any clinical study. But essentially what it does is it ensures that everyone who's participating in that trial will be receiving active drug. You continue to collect information to see what that information can share with you. And I'll give you a little bit more specifics about what I mean specifically to the study that Kezar is working on for patients with autoimmune hepatitis. So a few seconds ago, I talked about the phases of a clinical trial. The phases each have a different purpose, and they can help researchers answer different questions. We put forward the clinical trial. We tell you what phase it is, and we seek volunteers like yourselves to participate in this trial. So the phases of clinical trials are first kind of the laboratory studies, that preclinical phase, which I shared with you a second ago. And the preclinical phase is often 3 to 6 years or even longer before we would even bring a potential new therapy to patients. And this really answers the question, should it be tested in humans? Do you have enough confidence that it might actually have a therapeutic benefit? Do you understand the characteristics of your drug before you bring it to patients? The next phase is called phase 1, and this is usually a smaller study. The number one goal of the study tends to be safety. Is this safe to give in patients? And often a company will actually do a phase 1 trial in patients who don't actually have the disease that you're actually studying. It can be done in healthy volunteers. And the question is, what dose is safe? And it's a good way of answering the question, but not necessarily studying it in patients who have the underlying disease. And after about phase 1, a full quarter of clinical development programs ceased to exist. You didn't learn enough information, or you learned that your drug was not safe enough to take it to the next phase. So phase 2 tends to be a larger study, usually 100 to 300 people. Ask the question, does it work? Is it still safe? And what you're really looking for is some element of signal that your drug is actually going to work to treat the disease that you're studying. And in that situation, a lot of studies fail in phase 2. So at this point, only a third of development programs will move forward to what's called phase 3. And phase 3 are much larger trials. They're almost always randomized placebo-controlled studies. You often run them in duplicate just to make sure that it wasn't just dumb luck that you showed efficacy in one trial but not in the other. And when you complete your phase 3, then you have the opportunity to go to the FDA or other regulatory authorities and say, look at this, all this data we've collected. We think that this is a meaningful new therapy that would help a lot of patients. And would you give us approval to bring it to patients? And what you can see, the numbers dwindle yet again, with only about less than a third of drugs who ever get to that place receiving the approval to be available to patients. And then after you get that approval, sometimes additional studies are conducted to learn more about how best to use that therapy. What are exactly the right patients? Are there ways to use it better in combination with other therapies? And it also tracks longer-term safety and the durability of the benefit of the drug. So one of the key things that we think about a lot in terms of conducting clinical trials is who's participating in these trials. And clinical trial awareness and racial disparities are a really important concern that we take very seriously. So one of the most important things to think about is that if you are conducting a study to show that the drug works in a group of patients who suffer from a specific disease, then you really want to make sure that the people included in your trials represent the people who are primarily living with this disease. And so, as a good example, autoimmune hepatitis disproportionately affects women over men. Doesn't mean that men don't get it, but it's disproportionately affects women. And so if we were to conduct a trial where we only enrolled men, then we couldn't pass the straight face test to basically say that this would work with everybody. So we work very hard to make sure that we understand the whole community of people affected by a given disease, and that we then go ahead and we make sure that they are represented in the clinical trials. And so a lot of this has to do with awareness of clinical trials, making sure that sites are available to the patients who are living with the disease that we're trying to study, And it leads to a lot of situations where we do often have sites that may even fail to enroll a single patient. So we try to overcompensate by that by having more sites. But then also one of the biggest barriers to participation in the study is that people say they don't understand clinical trials, which is really the underpinning and my motivation for being with you here today, to help you feel better about understanding clinical trials and how by participating in clinical trials, you can also help in the development of a potential new therapy for autoimmune hepatitis. So why is participating in clinical trials important? I think I've shared this with you. One is essential for developing treatments. You can't just say, oh, I put this stuff in a bottle and we think it's going to help people. You really have to prove it, and you have to prove that over years. We have to assess the safety and the efficacy, and often that is thought about in terms of the risk benefit. If the disease is very, very severe, can you tolerate a few more side effects than if the disease is very mild, where it wouldn't make sense to give someone a therapy that had very severe side effects? And so it's very important to learn about the drug in the setting of the disease that you're studying. Every clinical trial brings us one step closer to finding treatments and cures. And the goal, obviously, of bringing new therapies is to positively impact the lives of hundreds and thousands of people living with the diseases that you're trying to treat. We do want to give participants access to new therapies, especially in situations like autoimmune hepatitis, where there's been really no advancements in decades, and also where the therapies themselves often come with a burden that we believe that patients should be able to do better. And then also very important to remember that participation is always voluntary. So why is diversity in clinical trials important? Well, again, I think I shared this with you, is that we want to represent the people who are living with this disease. And this can include gender, as the example I shared, race, ethnicity, religion, or socioeconomic background. Certain medicines may impact people differently. And so again, ethnically and racially diverse audiences that are underrepresented in clinical trials means we wouldn't learn that until far too late to make sure that we can use the drug most effectively in patients who may have some background differences. Inclusion of participants from diverse backgrounds furthers research and helps us find better ways to fight diseases that disproportionately impacts populations. And it's important for individuals of varied races, ethnicities, ages, gender, and sexual orientation to feel comfortable to participate in clinical trials. And this is something that we take very, very seriously. So we are going to have a question and answer phase at the end of this. I'm going to switch to talking a bit more about autoimmune hepatitis right now and the study we're going forward to. But when we do get to Q&A, I'm happy to take questions about clinical trials in general. So let's move on to a closer look in autoimmune hepatitis. And so many of you know on this call that autoimmune hepatitis is a chronic immune-mediated inflammatory disease of the liver. The name says it all. Autoimmune, meaning that the immune system mistakenly attacks healthy cells. Hepa refers to the liver, and the itis refers to inflammation. And the course of the disease of autoimmune hepatitis is generally progressive. AIH may start as acute inflammation in the liver, and this can go on to cause chronic damage in the form of cirrhosis or even liver failure. AIH is considered a rare autoimmune liver disease. It affects all ages and ethnicities, but affects women disproportionately, and the female to male ratio is approximately 4:1. The worldwide prevalence of AIH in adults ranges from 4 to 42 per 100,000 people. And in the US, AIH prevalence is as high as 30 per 100,000. But again, as mentioned below, it still does qualify as a rare disease. And one of the things that we're learning is both the incidence and the prevalence of AIH are increasing. And this may be, in fact, that the disease is occurring more frequently for reasons we don't really understand, but it also may be because organizations such as the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association are raising awareness of this disease. So more people who are suffering from this disease are getting an appropriate diagnosis and treatment earlier. So many patients are intolerant of the current therapies available to treat AIH. And once therapies are stopped, the disease often comes back or relapses. And these pie graphs here represent kind of usual response to treatment. And so in the beginning, up to about 65% of people can actually achieve a remission, means that there's no evidence of inflammation in their liver, but many of them will relapse. A full almost 80% will relapse. And it's this population that we really want to target, this kind of ability to respond to therapies. But then if you try to taper these therapies, which often have significant toxic profiles, that then you end up relapsing. And it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle of balancing the tolerability and the side effects of the treatment versus the disease itself. So this is an eye chart test slide in terms of the therapies used to treat autoimmune hepatitis, but they're listed on the side here, corticosteroids, with the best examples of it being prednisone and budesonide. Immunosuppressive therapies such as azathioprine, MMF, tacrolimus or cyclosporin, and some biologics, namely rituximab. And many of you are probably familiar with these. The vast majority of these therapies work by turning the volume down on the immune system. So if you remember up front, I said autoimmune hepatitis is that the immune system is mistakenly affecting or trying to clear away healthy cells. The idea behind many of these therapies is to turn the volume down on the immune system or cause immunosuppression in order to reduce that inflammation. So what are the unmet needs in AIH if you have that long list of therapies above? Well, probably the biggest one is the fact that all of those therapies come with a strong cost, a lengthy list of side effects, and of course, the idea that you're living with a compromised immune system is not a good way to expect to live without complications over many years. And so if you could design a perfect drug that could reduce the inflammation in the liver without causing potential toxicity or potential immunosuppression, then that would be a more ideal therapy for the treatment of autoimmune hepatitis. And so I think that all of you are aware that there's real need in the autoimmune hepatitis community to have better treatment options that are either more selective or have the ability to preserve the health of the liver, to ameliorate some of the symptoms that come along with having autoimmune hepatitis, like the very severe fatigue, but without the cost of the current immunosuppressants. And this slide just kind of says what I just said in a list form. So improving symptoms is always important, reducing inflammation, which can be assessed through blood tests, achieving full out remission, even if that means needing to keep the medicine in place, prevent disease progression, so avoid the chronic damage and scarring of the liver that can occur, prevent relapse, and then overall, and most importantly, improve quality of life. So with that background in autoimmune hepatitis, I'm going to move to talking about the Portola trial. And the Portola trial is a trial of that's currently enrolling right now of autoimmune hepatitis. We're looking at a drug called zetomipzomib, and I'm going to share with you what zetomipzomib is in a bit. But zetomipzomib is Kezar's new therapy that we are investigating in this trial of autoimmune hepatitis. The study's name is Portola, because here at Kezar, we tend to name our studies after neighborhoods in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so Portola is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 2I study that also has an open label extension portion. So what does all of that mean? Well, the first part of Portola is a 6-month study where patients will get either our potential new therapy, zetomipzomib, or placebo in a blinded fashion. And then after completion of those 6 months, everybody will be eligible to get zetomipzomib in an open label extension study if you choose to opt into it. The rationale of the study is as follows, is that zetomipzomib works by inhibiting this very key bit of machinery called the immunoproteasome. And the immunoproteasome is a bit of machinery that exists in all of our immune cells. And it's a very specific bit of machinery to immune cells. What we've learned in preclinical work, as well as in some of our early clinical studies, is that zetomipzomib is very potent at decreasing inflammation. And we've seen this across a number of models of autoimmune disease, including rheumatoid arthritis, myositis, lupus, and a subgroup of patients called who suffer from lupus nephritis. Clinically, zetomipzomib has been studied in over 200 people to date, including healthy volunteers and patients with lupus and lupus nephritis, as well as another autoimmune disease called polymyositis and dermatomyositis. And through studying over these 200 people, we've demonstrated that the safety profile of zetomipzomib is quite good, and we feel very comfortable with the way we give the medicine, which is by a subcutaneous injection once per week. And we feel very good about the doses that we believe can have a meaningful therapeutic benefit and also be safe at the same time. And one of the other things that we've learned over the course of this is there does not seem to be any signs that you are actually suppressing the immune system. But of course, this is something we continue to watch for. So what do we know about zetomipzomib to date? So as I mentioned, it's a completely first-in-class selective inhibitor of the immunoproteasome. So there's really no other therapy out there that works in this way. We're the first people who are working on it, and that comes with an upside and a downside, because we can't be very reassuring in saying, oh, this is just like this other thing that you may or may not be familiar with. But it's also very, very exciting, and it does have an opportunity to really change the treatment landscape for people with autoimmune hepatitis as well as other autoimmune disease. We've shown it to be safe and tolerable in preclinical phase 1 and phase 2 studies. As I mentioned, it's given as a once weekly injection under the skin. It is not a steroid, and there's no evidence that it impacts the way that normal immune system cells work, and it certainly doesn't lead to reducing the total number of immune cells that you have in your body. It can be taken with other medications. To date, we believe it can be safe during pregnancy, although we do not study it in women who are pregnant or interested in becoming pregnant in the next year. And then very, very importantly, because we don't impact things like white blood cell counts and other things that some of the other agents will impact, there's no monitoring required for use of this medication. So this is an overview of the Portola trial itself. We are aiming to enroll 24 adult patients with autoimmune hepatitis. You need to have some level of activity of your disease. So essentially meaning the medicines that you may be on are not working as well as you would like them to, or you and your physician would like them to. And also very importantly, that there's a reason for you to try why you have not responded to other therapies. And so this is really a study for people who may need to make a change in their therapy regardless. We give zetomipzomib 60 milligram once weekly, and you can stay on your background therapies. while you have zetomipzomib added to your therapy. In addition, there's one arm of the study where patients will get placebo. And so you can understand that even if you're in the placebo arm, you will be able to take all of your usual medications. We are trying to taper prednisones because that's one of the things that we believe is the benefit of zetomipzomib, is that it can work in place of prednisone or budesonide. And so we are going to ask in the protocol that that be tapered if it is tolerated. But of course, if it's not tolerated or your disease gets worse off of that, then you would not be left with untreated disease. And then after the 24 weeks of the trial, everybody will be given the option to opt into what's called an open label extension study, where you'd be able to receive zetomipzomib for an additional 6 months. So everyone who got it before will continue to get it, and everybody who got placebo in the first 24 weeks will then have the option to get zetomipzomib as part of this open label extension. So who might qualify for Portola? So again, adults with a clinically active autoimmune hepatitis and evidence of active disease despite current medication regimens. You must be willing to use and taper glucocorticoid therapy, since prednisone and budesonide are the mainstay of treatment. Obviously, we suspect most of you are on that, and most of you really would like to come off of that as well. It's one of the goals of the therapy, and we want to be able to ensure that we're able to address that question in this clinical trial. And you must be willing and able to return for all of your protocol-specific study visits and complete all the studies required procedures, which your site and the investigator will review with you as part of that informed consent process. We fully recognize that participating in a clinical trial is disruptive to your regular life, and everyone wants to live life fullest, going to school, have their jobs, have their families, and the last thing you want to do is have extra doctor's appointments. So we do our very best to reduce the burden of participation. All study assessments and procedures are provided to participants in the trial at no cost. You do receive a small stipend for each completed study visit. We are working to install home services, so essentially the study can be brought to your house. One, if you are open to that, and two is if it's convenient. And we're working on our best to make that available across the country, but there may be regions where we are unable to. And then we also provide travel concierge services where at no out-of-pocket expense to you, you can travel to the site for the protocol mandated care. If you are interested in learning more, there are these QR codes here. We will provide additional information through AIHA. We're available on our website, Kezar Life Sciences, and also a website called clinicaltrials.gov that lists all approved clinical trials. So thank you so much for allowing me to join you today. It's really been a pleasure, and I am open to question and answer.
Thank you, Dr. Henig. We really appreciate your candid approach to speaking to clinical trials as well as AIH, and then also these new opportunities. There's been a few questions in the chat box, which I'd like to get to, and they focus more on the Portola study. I've read some questions too that maybe we could talk about clinical trial overview as well, but maybe we'll start with the Portola piece. I think there was some questions particularly about, and I think some of the questions were answered, but particularly moving to an extension part of the study, assuming you have to go through the first part of the study, the randomization and the 2-to-1 approach, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so no one can jump to the open label extension. And this is actually kind of a nuance, and I'm glad you asked. So sometimes when you're involved in a study, the open label extension can be offered at the end of anybody who's completing the study. And sometimes completion of the study may actually mean that you no longer give yourself the investigational agent for whatever reason. But as long as you continue to come to the study visits and have the appropriate data collected, then you are eligible to participate in the open label extension study.
Perfect, thank you. And I get this at my own clinic, particularly talking about some of these clinical trials, but even beyond an extension, let's say it works really well. And we don't know what the landscape is beyond in terms of regulation and approval. What are patients to do when they come out of extension?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as the sponsor, we have a number of options available to us. So one is we can actually amend the open label extension protocol and make it longer. So that's kind of an easy thing that if we saw that people were doing well, that we would entertain immediately. If you are seeing very strong benefit and it's kind of, unequivocal benefit, then we have the ability to speak with the regulatory authorities about different options where you may be able to do a shorter next study or some kind of options where you make the drug available. And last but not least, there's also an option of doing what are, there's a number of things called extended access programs, of which there's different options. And Kezar has actually supported one of those in the past with a patient in a similar situation with a different disease that we studied. So we are very open to that. And I think the impact, especially in a patient population where choices are so limited, it's more compelling to be open to all of those options.
Yeah, no, that's great. I like this question before we kind of get back to the clinical trials in general, but from Don, he asks, what would be the hoped results of Portola look like? And to put you on the spot, if this compound works well, what would you anticipate?
Yeah, that is absolutely the question that we often get. What does success look like in this study? And because you recognize that this is, the first step, and we likely will need to do another clinical trial after this. So what we would love to hear is that patients feel better. That to me is, that's what actually is the thing that motivates me the most, is I want to hear that patients are feeling better. We have all these tools to capture that sense of feeling better. We just want people to feel better. We want their liver function tests, especially their ALT, to be within normal range on zetomipzomib. And we want it to stay in that normal range in the absence of prednisone or other medicines that might be treating the underlying inflammation. And if we can show that, as well as that it's safe and well tolerated in people with AIH, then we have the ability to move forward with this development program.
Great. So again, moving a little bit back to clinical trials, but also diversity, which there are some really good points. I hear this from patients a lot too. People are wondering, do we have to go to Kezar to be participating in the study, or where else can we go? And what other centers are you thinking about opening up for this trial in AIH?
Right. So there, when we get through all the paperwork, there will be about 15 sites in the United States open and supporting the Portola trial. So Indiana University is the first up, but we have a number of sites that will be activated in the coming weeks. And over the next kind of 3 months, we hope to be up to much closer to that 15 site mark. We are working with people, individuals, because we understand that, with rare disease, people can be scattered and clinical trial sites may not be that convenient to them. So we are trying to work with people who may be remote from any active site to try to match you up with the site if you're interested in participating. Craig, I think you're on mute.
Apologize. One of the last questions that came up about the design of the study was inclusion exclusion. Could you speak a little bit to beyond, you talked about relapse and flares. What about baseline liver function disease, cirrhosis or decompensation, even transplant?
Right. So patients who had a transplant would be excluded. Patients who have autoimmune hepatitis and another diagnosis, such as primary biliary cirrhosis or sclerosing cholangitis, are excluded from this early trial. and patients who have evidence of a poorly functioning liver. So will also be excluded from this trial.
Thank you. So going back to the center approach, what does it really take? And I think patients need to know this. What does it take for a center to do a clinical trial? We hear a lot of complaints that there's not enough trials. Why aren't there more? Are centers the barrier? Is that the rate limiting step? Or what can we do as a patient organization of patients to enhance that capacity in the United States as well? Many questions, but maybe we could speak globally to it.
No, and this is really a shout out to the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association. So for years and years, autoimmune hepatitis has not really been on the radar screen for sponsors or drug developers in terms of thinking about new therapies for this patient population. And one of the reasons for that is because it is so difficult to conduct clinical trials. There's an extraordinary amount of resource intensive work that goes into setting up a site, the whole team at the site, the investigator, the study coordinators, the pharmacists, the people who maintain the blinding, the support staff. And you do all that. And in the absence of being able to talk about your trial and attract patients, you could easily put those resources in and have a site that never enrolled a single patient. The Autoimmune Hepatitis Association, because you have kind of put together this beautiful network of physicians who are very passionate about making a difference in the lives of people with autoimmune hepatitis, that gave a company like Kezar the opportunity to just kind of speed dial a whole bunch of people and say, do you want to support the Portola trial? And the response was overwhelmingly positive. And then the opportunity to reach out to people who are living with autoimmune hepatitis or know people who are living with autoimmune hepatitis really does also help you as a sponsor feel like you could really make the study go. You could actually get it done and you could actually get meaningful results out of the trial. And that's a huge advantage. And I will share with you that given choices of how to use a company's resources to investigate different diseases, having the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association really did increase our ability to actually pursue this trial. And so we're very grateful and we're very thankful to partner with you on this.
Well, that's great to hear, and that's what we're all about and what we're built for. Because you now have some interesting perspective in talking to a lot of different sites, could you share with our members a little bit about what the investigators that you approached these sites said when you said you had a new potential compound for AIH, and what was their assessment based on need or interest?
Yeah. So we had some really outstanding conversations with many, many investigators. A lot of folks who have a passion for treating patients with autoimmune hepatitis work at academic centers. And those tend to be the biggest skeptics, right? You guys are all, everyone's schooled to be ask question and need to be convinced of the heavy science. And so we were able to share the data from our other studies, as well as the preclinical work of why we believe that inhibition of the immunoproteasome could have a potentially meaningful therapeutic benefit in patients with autoimmune hepatitis. We were able to share the safety profile as we've learned it to date, and kind of share the overall scientific rationale of why we believe that this is a worthwhile endeavor. And across the board, the response was very, very positive, because I think that people who are in the trenches working with people living with this disease really understand how limited the treatment options are, and something that works in a completely different way creates a really important opportunity, especially if it means that patients don't need to live with immunosuppression.
Thank you for that. And the last big topic, as I've gone through these messages, kind of centers on diversity in clinical trials. And there's a lot of discussion about equity and health equity, but even clinical trial equity has been an important point for us. Is there a strategy that Kezar has employed to think about enrolling patients of color or again from different ethnic or even socioeconomic backgrounds as
Yeah.
well, because these are often excluded from clinical trials, as you well know. And again, if you just for our members, we talked about this before, but many of the clinical trials that have been published in the space of AIH, besides being old and small, often only include a majority of white or Caucasian individuals as well.
So we talk about it all the time, actually, and we want to do better all the time. One of the things that we probably learned is that the best way to address it is actually solving the problems at a site-by-site level, and often working with investigators and even individual patients to solve some of the challenges. And there's a variety of things that get done. So as an example, I mean, this is just one of many examples, is it's often a challenge for people to take time off of work to participate in a clinical trial. So we will work with the site to see if they can offer evening or Saturday hours, or as I mentioned, having the home health services be able to bring the trial to someone's house, if they're open to that, at least some of the time to reduce the total burden of participation. You know, trying, like I mentioned, we have a concierge service that essentially prevents out-of-pocket expenses for people who are participating in the trial. And that can, as you can imagine, is often a barrier for patients who have socioeconomic constraints. And so no one has to wait to be reimbursed. And so those are some of the many things that we're doing, but my best response is just ask. If anyone has any good ideas, just ask and we'll see what we can do with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And the final question here, because I want to say just a few minutes in, I have a few slides to go over before we leave, but there's been consideration about age in the environment. Again, can you remind us about the age limits and what's necessary?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. So as you know, autoimmune hepatitis often affects people who are quite young, including pediatric patients and young adolescents. And so we spent a lot of time talking about what the right age to study patients in the Portola trial was. It is specifically for people who are age 18 and above, but we have put in place all of the right things so that if we do show a positive signal from the Portola trial, the next study will likely include individuals of younger than 18 years.
Thank you. And Melissa says to clarify, those that have cirrhosis are excluded. And I don't think that's correct. And Dr. Henig, please correct me, but we're looking for patients that are cirrhosis, but controlled liver disease without what we call decompensation.
Right.
So even if you have cirrhosis, you could be included in this trial if you meet the other inclusion exclusion criteria as well.
That's exactly right. We look for predominantly what we focus on is the function. So the liver has many, many functions. And as long as the functions are all functioning the way they're supposed to, and we recognize that by definition, there's active inflammation. So the signs of inflammation are there, but the actual function of the liver is preserved, then the person can be considered for the trial.
Fantastic, thank you. All I would love to have you applaud silently and thank Dr. Henig for being with us today on Rare Disease Day to talk about clinical trials, the importance of them, as well as the Portola study. Before we end, I'm just going to share my screen briefly and just present two small pieces. And I think it's clear that we know there are many needs among few patients, and Dr. Henig really solidified the importance of involvement in clinical study or in clinical trials for AIH. Because we know that there's really been little progress in the treatment and or management therapeutics of AIH really since the initial sentinel studies way back in the 60s and 70s. And I'm almost embarrassed as an investigator to even speak to that point. But a lot of that can really be found when we notice the significant side effects that are still persistent in this disease, or side effects of medications as well. Ultimately, also, as Dr. Henig said, the inadequate treatment response. A large proportion of patients or patients that require dependency on steroids to normalize liver tests or keep liver tests normal. And then, as we also have said, outside the liver is what I talk about extrahepatic, the symptoms, the fatigue, the poor sleep, the bone pain, the itch, the things that keep people up at night with this disease. There are a number of unmet needs for worth investigation, but also our medications are just not adequate. I want to solidify that. I think forward my screen here, maybe we can't. I'm going to come back here for a second. There we go. That we have a registry at the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association, and this is our rare disease plug for our registry. We have used this registry to collect over 130 individuals with prospective data looking at demographics, but also medical therapy, as well as quality of life data. And we do this prospectively, meaning we do this every year going forward. Doing this helps us to better understand what type of therapies are being prescribed, but also how those may correlate with side effects or symptoms. And we've made this very simple through the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association by first looking at our study materials. And you can look at this on our website, and the website is below, but then just contacting our registry coordinator at this email, which is registry@aipep.org. You're able to do everything virtually and again, very quickly as well. And again, this is just a very easy sentinel step that if you haven't participated in AIH-based research, I would definitely implore you to consider this, as it's super easy to do. We are also excited that with this registry, we'll move to look at biospecimens and DNA and other things in the future. But these are the foundational pieces that we can use and survey patients as well. And we've used this actually to look at preliminary numbers for companies such as Kezar, obviously de-identified data, but also to understand what are the needs of the patients of our organization. So if you would like more information or would love to get involved, please visit our website or also email registry@ai.org. To that end, I will stop staring and I wish you all a very happy Rare Disease Day. And again, from the Autoimmune Hepatitis Association, we love having these events. Dr. Henig, once again, thank you for being here. We look forward to more as we build a culture of research, but also participation with our autoimmune hepatitis patients. So thank you again.
Thank you. And we are really value the partnership with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.